The Pacific War was not fought in familiar landscapes of rolling fields or ruined European cities. It was waged across jungles, coral atolls, and stretches of beach where every grain of sand seemed to conceal danger. By 1943 and 1944, American forces had learned the hard way that assaulting a Japanese-held island was unlike any battle they had faced before. Each landing required soldiers to storm ashore while exposed to an enemy dug deep into caves and concrete bunkers. For the men in those landing craft, the ocean spray on their faces mixed with the anticipation of what awaited them. The beach was not just a destination, it was a killing ground designed to stop them cold. Imagine the sound of the engines roaring as the boat surged forward, the smell of salt water heavy in the air, and the sight of distant tree lines where defenders watched silently. Japanese forces had prepared for this exact moment, placing machine guns, mortars, and artillery in perfect position to pour fire onto exposed attackers. For American infantry, there was no cover, no armor to shield them from that first wave of destruction. They had only their rifles, helmets, and the courage to leap into hell itself. Death often struck before a single soldier's boots touched the sand. Japanese commanders were certain of the outcome. They believed no army could sustain repeated beach assaults under such conditions, and if one did, it would never bring heavy weapons across the breaking waves in time to matter. In their minds, the sea acted as a natural barrier, stripping invaders of the advantage of armor. A tank was a machine for land, heavy and immovable in water. To picture one rolling out of the surf was to picture a fantasy. That belief formed the bedrock of their defensive confidence. For the United States, however, failure was not an option. Each island represented a stepping stone across the Pacific, leading closer to Japan itself. The beaches were the gateways to victory, no matter how deadly. Soldiers knew they would face fire the moment ramps dropped. Yet they also knew that every battle won on the sand brought them closer to ending the war. Still, with every new landing, the grim toll mounted. The bodies of fallen men often lay where the tide reached them, reminders of how costly each step could be. This context set the stage for one of the most startling sights of the Pacific theater. As American landing craft approached, the defenders braced for the familiar, for lines of infantry struggling under fire. Yet sometimes, in those crucial moments, a new shape began to emerge from the waves. At first, it seemed impossible. Dark silhouettes rose higher than the surf, armored and defiant against the storm of bullets. They were tanks moving under their own power, rolling straight out of the ocean. The defenders stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. For the Japanese troops in their bunkers, it was as if the sea itself had betrayed them. What was meant to be an open trap suddenly became a battlefield where their carefully laid defenses crumbled. The thunder of tank engines echoed across the beaches, followed by the sharp crack of their guns firing back. Soldiers who had braced to mow down rows of infantry now found themselves under the steel gaze of machines that should not have been there. Shock rippled through the lines, and with it, a chilling realization. Their certainty had been broken. For the Americans, the feeling was entirely different. Where once men felt naked against an ocean of fire, now they advanced with a shield that rolled beside them. The tanks drew enemy fire, silenced strongholds, and opened paths across deadly sands. Each one that surged ashore carried not just armor and weapons, but hope. Soldiers who might have hesitated at the waterline now pushed forward, knowing they were not alone. The sight of tanks emerging from the waves turned fear into determination. This was the hook of a new chapter in warfare. The Pacific Islands had long been seen as natural strongholds, but with the arrival of amphibious tanks, the equation changed. The impossible had become real, and with it came a shift that neither side could ignore. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of disbelief. For the Americans, it was the first sign that innovation could conquer even the most merciless battlefields. The war on the beaches would never look the same again. For the Japanese defenders, the arrival of American troops had always been expected in one form. They envisioned waves of infantry leaping from landing craft, rifles in hand, charging headlong across the sand. Their defenses were built to exploit this moment, to pour fire into unprotected men who had nowhere to hide. In their minds, the beach was a bottleneck, a place where numbers meant nothing, and where steel fortifications gave them every advantage. But what they had not accounted for was the intrusion of a weapon that seemed to defy the natural boundary between sea and land. Japanese military doctrine held that tanks belonged to the ground war. Heavy machines could not swim, and the logistics of placing them directly onto hostile beaches seemed absurd. Even as they studied American operations in earlier campaigns, the concept of armored vehicles arriving in the first wave never crossed their minds. When the tanks appeared grinding forward out of the surf, it was more than a shock of sight. It was a collision between expectation and reality, a collapse of certainty that unsettled even the most hardened defenders. For the men watching from inside bunkers, disbelief gave way to fear. Imagine standing in a reinforced position, machine gun aimed toward the shore, expecting to mow down advancing soldiers. Instead, the sound that reaches you is not just rifle fire, but the deep mechanical growl of engines, followed by the piercing crack of a tank gun. The ground shakes, smoke fills the air, and suddenly your carefully positioned stronghold feels vulnerable. The contrast between what was supposed to happen and what actually unfolded created confusion that rippled through every Japanese unit on the beach. On the American side, the difference was equally striking. Infantry, who had once been forced to sprint across open sand, now found themselves advancing behind moving walls of armor. The tanks absorbed fire that would have cut down dozens of men in seconds. They offered not only physical protection, but psychological strength. Soldiers who had once felt exposed now found renewed confidence as steel monsters pushed forward at their side. The transformation of the battlefield was immediate, and its impact was undeniable. The shock extended beyond the first moments of combat. Japanese commanders who had trusted their layered defenses saw them unravel far too quickly. The plans they had drawn up relied on the assumption that the enemy would be fragile until reinforcements and armor could be brought ashore hours later. Instead, the Americans arrived fully equipped from the first wave. The defenders were no longer in control of the pace of battle, and their confidence was shattered. The very foundation of their defensive strategy proved to be flawed. This conflict between expectation and reality revealed more than just a tactical gap. It highlighted the deeper contrast between two wartime approaches. The Japanese relied on tradition, discipline, and fixed defenses, convinced that their preparation would compensate for material disadvantages. The Americans relied on adaptation, innovation, and industrial might, willing to challenge what was thought to be impossible. When amphibious tanks rolled from the surf, the difference between those two philosophies became visible on the sand of the Pacific Islands. The disbelief of the Japanese was not simply surprise at a new machine. It was the realization that their entire worldview of warfare was being upended before their eyes. The tanks represented more than steel and firepower. They symbolized a nation capable of reshaping the battlefield in ways their enemy could not anticipate. The shock of that revelation echoed through every clash, creating a contrast that would define the battles to come. The amphibious tank was not born out of ambition alone, but out of necessity. Early in the Pacific Campaign, American commanders faced the grim reality that traditional landings left soldiers desperately exposed. Waves of infantry often charged into walls of fire with no cover, and tanks could not be brought ashore quickly enough to change the outcome. Each operation became a bloodletting where courage alone could not compensate for the lack of heavy support. The need for innovation was urgent, and the search for a solution became a matter of survival as much as strategy. American engineers were given a clear challenge: create a machine that could move from ship to shore under its own power, then fight like a tank once on land. It was an idea that seemed improbable, even absurd, in the early stages. How could such a heavy vehicle, armored with steel and armed with cannons, possibly navigate the waves? Yet wartime desperation often transforms the impossible into the inevitable. Workshops and testing grounds across the United States became laboratories of urgency, where new designs were sketched, built, and tested in rapid succession. The first prototypes were awkward and flawed, sometimes failing spectacularly during trials. Tanks sank, stalled, or proved too cumbersome to maneuver in the surf. Soldiers watching the tests doubted that such a vehicle could ever be trusted in real battle. But behind each failure was a determination that refusal was not an option. Engineers refined their designs, adjusted flotation devices, and experimented with propulsion systems. The urgency of war pressed them forward, and each iteration brought the concept closer to reality. By the time the tanks were finally ready for deployment, they represented far more than mechanical ingenuity. They were proof of America's industrial resilience, the ability to harness factories, mines, and manpower to overcome challenges at unprecedented speed. For every soldier who had seen comrades fall helplessly on the beaches, the arrival of these amphibious tanks felt like a long-awaited answer. No longer would infantry be forced to cross killing grounds entirely unshielded. The tanks promised to carry both firepower and protection to the most vulnerable point of the assault. For the Japanese, the very existence of such machines was unthinkable. Their war planning had not anticipated an enemy capable of blending naval and ground power so seamlessly. The idea that an armored column could begin its attack in the ocean and continue unbroken onto the land clashed with every expectation. This was more than a new weapon, it was a new philosophy of war. American ingenuity had rewritten the script before the battle even began. To the men who crewed these tanks, the machines were not just tools of war, but lifelines. Each one represented a chance to save lives that might otherwise have been lost in futile charges across open sand. The roar of the engines, the weight of the armor, and the steady roll forward symbolized a kind of protection that soldiers had once thought impossible in those first terrifying minutes of a landing. When the tanks finally appeared in battle, they carried with them not only steel and fire, but also the hopes of thousands who had endured too much loss. In this way, the origins of the amphibious tank were rooted not just in mechanics, but in the human need to adapt, to survive, and to prevail. They were machines born of desperation and ingenuity, brought to life by the urgency of a war that demanded solutions faster than ever before. By the time they rolled into combat, they had already proven something vital, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, innovation could reshape the battlefield and open the path to victory. When the amphibious tanks first entered combat, the effect was immediate and dramatic. For American infantrymen who had grown accustomed to sprinting across open beaches under murderous fire, the sight of armored vehicles rolling beside them felt almost surreal. Imagine being one of those soldiers, water still dripping from your uniform, as the thunder of a tank engine drowns out the rattle of enemy guns. The machine's steel hull becomes your shield, deflecting bullets that would otherwise cut you down. With each step forward, you feel less like prey on a killing field and more like part of an unstoppable force. The tanks did not merely provide psychological relief, they actively transformed the rhythm of combat. Their guns silenced bunkers that had once pinned down advancing troops for hours. They crushed obstacles, carved paths through barbed wire, and forced Japanese defenders to react in ways they had not anticipated. Where once the beach was a gauntlet of fear, it became a launching ground for coordinated assault. Infantry could move in synchrony with armor, advancing behind a wall of steel that absorbed the enemy's fury. The battlefield that had once devoured lives now opened a narrow but crucial corridor of survival. For the Japanese defenders, the shock was palpable. Their defensive positions, carefully prepared to repel infantry, suddenly proved inadequate against armored firepower arriving in the first wave. Machine gun nests that had been perfectly angled to sweep the sand were no match for cannon shells tearing through concrete and timber. Imagine crouching in a bunker, hearing the grinding of treads on coral, followed by the devastating explosion of a tank round. The defenses that had once given confidence now felt fragile. their strength dissolving under relentless assault. What was once a battlefield of certainty turned into a stage of disbelief. The impact reached beyond the immediate destruction of fortifications. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to expect dominance at the shoreline, now faced a new reality that stripped away their psychological advantage. Instead of confident defenders striking down unprotected invaders, they found themselves scrambling under superior firepower. The tanks did not only break walls of stone and sand, they broke morale. Panic spread where confidence once stood, and hesitation replaced the mechanical precision of well-rehearsed defenses. The shock of the tank's arrival reverberated through every moment of combat. For the Americans, the battlefield felt different as well. Victories that might once have taken hours of grinding combat came more quickly, and losses that might have numbered in the hundreds were reduced. Soldiers no longer looked at the water's edge as the most terrifying moment of the battle, because now they could trust in armored support. The coordination between man and machine turned chaos into something resembling order, even in the face of withering fire. The tanks provided not just protection, but momentum, allowing beachheads to be secured with unprecedented speed, yet the machines were not perfect. Some bogged down in soft sand or became easy targets for artillery fire once ashore. Others were lost in the surf before they even reached land, swallowed by the waves they were designed to conquer. But even when they failed, the psychological presence of those that succeeded had already altered the fight. Each tank that rumbled forward carried with it a message. The United States would not be stopped at the shoreline. The battle would be fought not on Japanese terms, but on American ones, defined by innovation and relentless pressure. In this way, the impact of amphibious tanks on the battlefield was both practical and symbolic. They saved lives, destroyed defenses, and made possible the victories that carried the Pacific Campaign forward. More importantly, they represented the collapse of the old order of combat, where beaches were seen as insurmountable obstacles. Now they were stepping stones. The war in the Pacific had entered a new phase, and the presence of amphibious armor made clear that the tide was shifting toward the Allies with every wave that broke on the sand. The consequences of deploying amphibious tanks reached far beyond the beaches themselves. For the Japanese, the psychological blow was severe. Their soldiers had been trained and conditioned to believe that the shoreline was a place of dominance, where any invading force would crumble under concentrated fire. That belief shattered the moment tanks rolled out of the sea, defying everything they had prepared for. Suddenly, their elaborate defenses seemed outdated, and the confidence that once anchored their fighting spirit gave way to doubt. The impact of this realization rippled through units like a silent but devastating weapon. Morale began to erode in ways that were difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. Soldiers who once believed themselves invincible in their fortified positions now questioned their ability to repel the enemy. Commanders who had trusted their defensive blueprints were forced to confront their failure in real time. Imagine being an officer watching your carefully built bunkers collapse under tank fire while your men scatter in confusion. The sense of control vanishes, replaced by a creeping fear that the enemy's innovation has rendered your efforts useless. This loss of psychological ground was as destructive as any shell or bullet. For the United States, the consequences were profoundly different. Amphibious tanks provided not only a tactical advantage, but also a strategic reassurance. Planners could now envision assaults on fortified islands without automatically accepting catastrophic losses. The tanks offered a way to bridge the deadly gap between sea and land, turning what had been the most vulnerable stage of battle into one of opportunity. This shift allowed the U.S. military to maintain momentum, moving from one island to the next with greater confidence. Each successful landing became proof that innovation could overcome even the strongest defenses. The presence of these tanks also changed the way American soldiers experienced combat. Troops who had once dreaded the first minutes of a landing now advanced with a sense of hope. They knew that armor would be with them, that firepower would support them, and that the enemy's bunkers would not stand unchallenged. This bolstered morale across the ranks, giving ordinary infantrymen the confidence to push forward. In a war where the human spirit often made the difference between victory and defeat, that confidence was invaluable. The tanks were more than machines, they were symbols of survival. Japanese defensive doctrine began to crumble under the weight of this new reality. What had once been their strongest card, the ability to crush enemies at the waterline, was suddenly ineffective. The balance of power shifted, and with it, the rhythm of the Pacific Campaign. Each island taken with fewer losses meant the Americans could push forward faster, sustaining pressure that Japan could not match. The defenders found themselves on the back foot, reacting instead of dictating the course of battle. Their belief in impregnable strongholds had been exposed as an illusion. On a broader level, the success of amphibious tanks highlighted the stark difference between the two nations at war. Japan, bound by rigid doctrine and limited industrial capacity, could not easily adapt to the new threat. The United States, with its vast resources and relentless drive for innovation, demonstrated that warfare could be reshaped by imagination as much as by firepower. This contrast underscored the growing gap in capability, a gap that widened with every successful landing. For the Japanese, disbelief hardened into grim recognition. For the Americans, each beachhead secured felt like proof of inevitable victory. The wider consequences of these tanks extended beyond tactics and strategy. They embodied a larger truth about modern warfare, that adaptability often decides the outcome more than sheer numbers or entrenched defenses. Amphibious tanks were not perfect, and they did not eliminate loss or suffering, but they changed the terms of battle. They undermined enemy morale, elevated Allied confidence, and accelerated the pace of the Pacific Campaign. In the end, their presence echoed far beyond the beaches where they fought. They became a symbol of how ingenuity could tilt the scales of war, reshaping history one landing at a time. The climax of this story unfolded not in the planning rooms or the factories, but on the beaches where men fought and died. It was there, in the clash of waves and fire, that disbelief collided with brutal reality. Japanese soldiers who had sworn their beaches were unassailable suddenly found themselves face to face with a nightmare they had never imagined possible. Out of the sea came tanks, churning forward through the surf, their guns already searching for targets. What was once thought to be fantasy now roared across the shoreline in steel and thunder. Imagine standing in a bunker, your ears filled with the rattle of machine guns, your eyes scanning for silhouettes of infantry to cut down. Then, without warning, the ground begins to shake. The sound is different, deeper, mechanical, like a growl rising from the ocean itself. Through the haze of smoke and spray, you see the impossible. Tanks climbing out of the waves. Your trigger finger freezes, your breath catches, and in that instant, the certainty of defense collapses. Fear creeps in, not because you lack courage, but because the battlefield has shifted in ways you cannot comprehend. For the Americans, the climax was felt as a surge of power and possibility. Soldiers who had braced themselves for slaughter found instead that the tide of battle favored them. Advancing beside the tanks, they no longer moved like prey across open sand, but like hunters pressing forward with cover and fire at their side. Every step behind those machines felt like a defiance of fate. Men who expected to fall on the beach now felt shielded, their lives tethered to the relentless steel giants grinding forward. It was as if the tide itself had chosen to carry them toward victory. The Japanese defenses, so meticulously built, began to collapse under this weight. Bunkers crumbled beneath tank shells, machine gun nests fell silent, and lines of communication broke down as panic spread. What had been carefully ordered, layers of resistance became pockets of chaos, each one struggling to adapt to the new threat. The defenders who had once mocked the thought of armor appearing at the shoreline now fired desperately, realizing too late that their doctrine had failed them. The climax of disbelief was also the climax of destruction. The emotional toll on both sides was immense. For the Japanese, there was shame in defeat, the crushing realization that their fortresses were not invincible. For the Americans, there was a fierce exhilaration, a sense that they had overcome the most terrifying moment of battle. Soldiers who survived such landings would never forget the sight of tanks rolling through the surf. It became seared into their memory, a vision that turned despair into hope. To them, the tanks were not only weapons, but saviors, symbols of survival against impossible odds. At the heart of this climax was the collision of two philosophies. Japan relied on rigid preparation, believing fixed defenses could withstand any assault. The United States relied on adaptation, believing innovation could rewrite the terms of combat. When amphibious tanks surged out of the ocean, those two visions met in fire and steel. The outcome was undeniable. The defender's certainty crumbled, and the attacker's determination was validated. The battlefield bore witness to the moment when the balance of power irreversibly shifted. This climax was more than just a single battle or a single beach. It was the turning point that proved American ingenuity had the power to break through even the most entrenched defenses. It revealed in stark contrast the vulnerability of doctrines that failed to adapt. The tanks emerging from the surf became more than weapons. They were the embodiment of change, the undeniable force that shattered illusions and carved a new path forward in the Pacific War. In the aftermath of those landings, the amphibious tank stood as both a practical tool of war and a symbol of something greater. Though not flawless in design, it had accomplished what many thought to be impossible. It had transformed the shoreline, once a graveyard for infantrymen, into a battlefield where survival and progress were possible. For the Americans, each successful landing reinforced the belief that ingenuity and determination could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. For the Japanese, disbelief gave way to bitter recognition that their coastal strongholds could no longer be trusted to hold the tide. The legacy of these machines did not lie solely in their steel hulls or roaring engines. They carried with them the story of adaptation under pressure, of a nation willing to rethink what war demanded. Soldiers remembered not only the protection the tanks provided, but the morale they inspired. Imagine the relief of a young infantryman knowing that as he leapt from a landing craft, a tank was already churning through the waves beside him. That sense of being shielded, of not facing the enemy alone, became part of the enduring memory of the Pacific Campaign. For Japan, the lesson was harsher. Their carefully constructed doctrine, reliant on fixed defenses and the assumption of predictable invasions, had been outpaced by innovation. The arrival of amphibious tanks proved that no fortress was unbreakable if the enemy possessed the will and imagination to overcome it. The psychological blow resonated long after the battles themselves, contributing to the erosion of confidence across their military. The myth of impregnable beaches, once central to their defensive pride, was broken permanently. In a broader sense, the story of these tanks reshaped how military planners around the world thought about amphibious warfare. Beaches could no longer be seen as natural barriers. Instead, they became recognized as vulnerable thresholds that could be crossed with the right blend of technology and strategy. The image of steel machines rising from the sea and rolling into battle became a vivid reminder that the boundaries of possibility are often only as strong as the imagination of those who dare to challenge them. The future of warfare would not be dictated by tradition, but by the willingness to innovate. The men who fought alongside these machines carried their memories home, and those memories became part of the larger legacy of World War II. Veterans would speak of the sound of engines over the crash of surf, of the sudden surge of confidence when armor appeared on the beach. To them, the amphibious tanks were not abstract symbols, they were the difference between life and death. They represented the moment when despair shifted into hope, when an impossible obstacle was overcome by sheer determination. Their stories ensured that the machines lived on in more than just history books. Ultimately, the closing chapter of this story is not about machines alone, but about what they represented. They embodied the relentless drive of a nation to find solutions even in the darkest moments of war. They showed that innovation could tip the balance where brute force alone had failed. And they left behind a lesson that echoes across time. In war, as in life, Those who adapt will endure. The amphibious tanks of the Pacific were not only weapons of victory, they were proof that belief in the impossible can change the course of history itself.